The Door County Maritime Museum and Lighthouse Preservation Society had a long-held dream of having a floating exhibit out here in front of the museum. The dream became a reality through the tireless efforts of the grandson of Captain John Roen, John Asher, a former employee of Roen Steam Ship Company, Bob Purves, and the president of the board of directors, Dan Osted, and in succession, his executive directors, Doug Henderson, Brian Kelsey, that culminated in bringing the Roen Steam Ship Company's tug, John Purves, back to Sturgeon Bay. My name is Paul Groff. I am a member of the Rehab crew from 2004 to 2008, and honored to be interviewing all who were involved in this amazing labor of love. And I'd like to begin by having them introduce themselves to the camera, and then we'll go on in lifting up this story. So let's just go around the table and introduce ourselves and the role that we played in making this happen. Not a lengthy answer, but we'll get to more of the detail later. So Bob?
Bob Rolowitz. I worked on the tug for 23 years when the tug belonged to the Roen Steam Ship Company.
I'm Brian Kelsey, and I was the executive director of the Door County Maritime Museum from February of 2003 through the end of May 2008.
I'm Doug Henderson. I was the first executive director starting in February of 1993, and then in 2002 I moved from being the executive director to the curator.
I'm John Roen Asher. I'm the grandson of Captain John Roen. I am presently the president of Roen Salvage Company, and I've been on the board of directors here at the Maritime Museum for the past 20 years. And after we built this museum we have here now, the 22,000 square foot museum, it became a dream of myself and several others to get an exhibit out in front here, a water exhibit for the museum. And that's where I guess we got started on this.
Sure. You want to continue with that and just tell a little bit more about the dream, what you were looking for?
Well, I wanted, obviously being in the marine construction business and dealing with tugboats and barges, etc., it was my dream to get a tug, and I always thought if we could bring one back from our family, it would really be exciting. So, first of all, the tug Purves was purchased by my grandfather in 1956 from Consolidated Power and Water Company, and the following year, 1957, they removed the steam equipment on it and the bunker for the coal and turned it into a twin screw tug and put in two 900 horsepower GM engines in it. That was used by my grandfather to move around some of his larger equipment. The Marcus Roen, which is a 461 foot self-unloader. He had a couple larger car ferries that were converted into barges. They were about 330 feet long. He made tows with the Purves for those. And also for salvage work, when freighters might run ashore or run aground, they would use it to help pull them off the reefs or the sandbars. My grandfather passed away in December of 1970, and about 2 years later we started to sell equipment out of the estate, and the tug went through several companies when it was first purchased, but it eventually ended up with the Baltimore Marine Transportation Group, which was a subsidiary of the Canoni Company. They ran it for about 10 years, till about 1988, when it was purchased then by Andre Incorporated out of Muskegon, Michigan. The Andres had been very good friends of our family for probably 20 years before that, so we knew them well. Barb Andre was actually the president of Andre Inc., and her two sons, Phil and Stan Jr., were both in the business. Stan was in more of the transportation end of it, and Phil was in the construction end of it. So back in 2001, my wife and I were down in Florida, and we asked Phil and his wife Candace out for dinner one night. And while we were having dinner, I'd mentioned to him that we were still looking to get an exhibit at the Maritime Museum, and told him kind of kiddingly that if the John Purves was ever available, that we'd be interested in getting it. And a couple of years went by, and in November of 2003, I got a phone call from Phil asking if I was still interested in getting the tug back for the Maritime Museum. Well, I told him I had interest in it, but I first wanted to fly over to Muskegon and take a look at the tug and see if I thought we could actually pull this off and put it together and bring it back here. So the first thing I did was to call Bob Perlowitz, who had previously worked for Roen Salvage and also had worked for my grandfather, and who also was a chief engineer on this tug for 23 years, and asked Bob if he would be willing to fly over to Muskegon with me and take a look at the tug and see what would be involved to get it in museum presentation quality. So we put together a group of Brian, Kelsey, and Bob Perlowitz and myself, and we rented a plane out here at the Cherryland Airport and flew to Muskegon, where we were met by Phil Andre and Mike Caliando, who was one of the tug captains for Andre. And so we got a tour of the tugboat at the time, and she smelled terrible. Her bilges were full of oil and lots of other interesting things. The paint was peeling. It actually had been laid up for a couple of years in their yard. They had purchased some other larger tugs to start doing their transportation movements, so the Purves was expendable as far as Andre Inc. Was concerned. So I asked Bob, we were standing up in the pilot house, and I pretty much looked at him and said, Bob, you've got to let me know, do you think we can bring this back and put it together or not? And he looked kind of hard and long at me for a while, and finally he nodded yes, and I think that was the first go-ahead that convinced me that we should try and pull this off. So then I talked to Phil afterwards and told him that we were interested and we would like to bring it back for the museum. And that was in November of 2003. And in 2004, in February, we were able to get a gift agreement together between the museum and Andre Incorporated. Phil signed for the museum, Phil signed for Andre Inc., I signed for the museum as a board member. And from there on, we had to get it back to Sturgeon Bay. I told Phil that we possibly could bring one of our tugboats from Roen Salvage over in the fall and get it, but he said not to worry about it right now. They had to remove an upper pilot house and several other things they wanted to do before the tug would be ready to go. So later that year, in fact it was in November, so about a year later, Phil called me up and said that the tug was on its way to Sturgeon Bay. He was towing it with one of his own tugs, and brought it here, and it ended up in our yard at Roen Salvage for 4 years, while the boys rehabilitated it and restored it. And I guess tours began 4 years later in August of 2008.
John, even before you got involved, actually before you were even on the board, the original plan, which is nothing like what we have now, the original plan that was actually drawn up by Henry Isaacson, and that was used to the board took that to the city of Sturgeon Bay to get the permission to be able to use this property that we have here right on the waterfront. And in that drawing, there was a slip with a floating exhibit marked on it, and that was always one of the dreams. It's actually the slip where the fireboat is. When the current plan was drawn up by Ben Schenkelberg, he put that in also, and we had that dream, and there were lots of discussion. some crazy discussions, even before we looked at building the building. If you remember, we flew up to the Sioux and looked at, I can't remember what the museum was called up there that was in a actual ore carrier. We quickly made the decision that was not something we wanted to do. But there was discussion throughout the years whether we could find a PBI boat that was built here in Sturgeon Bay, something else that might have been built at one of the other yards, and none of those ever really came to fruition until the John Purves was available, and then a lot of people went to work on it, John Asher in particular, and it actually happened.
You know, I was very fortunate that the original documents that were created from Ben Schunkelberg, because when I came in and I had only been there a few months when this whole discussion came up of wanting to bring in a floating exhibit. On Wednesdays, a group with John would meet, and it was kind of like a strategic long-range planning group acting sometimes very short-term as well, and ideas and issues that they had for the museum and for the future of the museum. And I still remember when this came up, and suddenly we were flying over to go look at it. And when it all came to fruition and it was back here, it began the whole conversation with the city of Sturgeon Bay. So I was thankful that the foresight was there years before that, because it was really kind of the impetus of me being able to talk to the city council and the planning department to say, you had approved this years ago. We're just moving it from here to here. And I think that foresight years ago really made it a less of a burden in trying to get this located where it is today, because it did take some finagling to get it where it is today.
And that's absolutely correct, because when we originally built, the working waterfront was not part of the agreement with the museum. And Selvig Tugs sat out here, and if I remember correctly, once the museum started, they were on a 6-month lease each year, twice a year with the city, in anticipation that the city might want to move them somewhere else. And luckily, when the tug was ready to come over here, the city, Selvig, the Mobile Bay Coast Guard, all worked together to make this a reality, so that the tug was sitting straight out in front of the museum, as opposed to someplace else in town.
Right.
I do remember some of those conversations about what the floating exhibit might be here, Tug. Especially, you know, someone threw out maybe we could bring in the battleship Wisconsin. And,
Yes.
I mean,
That was somebody not involved with the museum, and she thought we could fly it in with a couple of helicopters.
But you know, long range goals, think big,
Yeah.
scale back.
but we did, like Doug mentioned, we did talk about Peterson Builders, that was brought up, and whether one of their vessels that were built years and years ago could be brought back here. But in the back of my mind, I always kind of thought the Roen tug here would look real nice. Yeah, so I was pushing for that. But another thing was, in our discussions, if you remember, at the board of directors meetings, Jeff Weberg was quite concerned about bringing an exhibit back here, especially a floating one,
Mm-hmm.
and how we were gonna pay for it,
Mm-hmm.
who was gonna take care of that, how are we gonna do that, where's it gonna be, what if we can't, it's a flop, you know, how are we gonna scrap it out? I mean, all these discussions came about, and it was quite interesting, because Jeff demanded that I put together a cost for everything.
Yes.
You remember that?
I remember it well.
And I had to give it to the board, and it was, how many people do you think will go through it, and how much are we gonna raise for it, and what's it gonna cost, et cetera, and I pretty much, you know, just basically told Jeff, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it. And I think pretty much that's what happened. And as you know, and probably talk about the results of the tours and money it's raised already, that we've exceeded our goals.
Sure. You know, just in bringing up the cost is, you know, on that initial flight over when the three of us went, I didn't know what to expect when we got there. I had seen pictures of the Butterfield, what it originally was. I had seen pictures, but to get there, when you talk about the stink, and you're not talking about what was inside of it, and You know, I grew up looking at sailboats and luxury yachts. I did not grow up with workhorses, and so when I walked in, my eyes just kept looking at Bob. Okay, how is Bob reacting? How was Bob reacting to this? And it was funny, because you would eventually see glimmers of smiles on his face. Like suddenly he'd look at something and smile, and you know, you could see the sparks going off in his mind that I think made me realize, okay, there is somebody here who has the passion for the project, because I think any of us know if you don't have someone who's going to take full leadership and just complete and utter ownership, a project like this, when you're working with volunteers who are doing this out of the goodness of their hearts, if you have somebody who's not as invested as them, it's not going to work. And so I think, you know, it's such a huge asset that you could see from that point in Muskegon, perhaps what we're all sitting in right now.
I would say, unbeknownst to both Doug and to you, Brian, I went over there with the intentions that if Bob said yes, I would do everything I could to get it here, but if Bob said no, I was not going to push to get this tug back here, because I knew what a tremendous project that this would involve. The other thing I knew, just knowing Bob from his work on cars, he's a hot rod guy, that he's not gonna do something, as they'd say, halfway. You know, it's gonna be done right, or it's not gonna be done at all. So once I got him with a nod with his head that we'll take it, I knew we were gonna be okay.
Well, Bob, that's a good lead-in for you. You're standing there, you've seen the tug and the condition it was in, and you began to anticipate this. Can you recall some of those initial thoughts and the processes that were going on in your mind?
Well, there was a lot of the equipment, the original equipment was missing, was taken off and was changed over the years. We had, after the tug was sold from the Roen Company, the wheel was gone, the pilot house controls were added, the telegraphs in the engine room and the pilot house were gone, and I knew it was gonna cost a lot of money to replace a lot of that equipment, but other than that, the basic whole tug was there, and it just took a lot of work, and we were really fortunate for the number of people that volunteered and worked on it through the years that it took to restore the tug.
Well, I can remember, Bob, you coming into my office on numerous occasions and saying, well, do we have a,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, and we would start searching through the warehouse and the exhibits and other places, and then we went online and we started searching for equipment, and it took a lot of time to find things, but it happened, and there were times you'd come in and say, hey, I've got a lead on a piece of brass.
Telegraphs, I remember.
I still had the keys for Roen Salvages. I had just retired, so all the buildings over there had a lot of equipment in there that we could use.
The key word there is had.
Yeah.
So John provided a lot of equipment that he knows, and probably a lot that he never did know that we used, and probably is still on here.
I think what's interesting is when it came back, it became the discussion of, we have this now, and it went to the curatorial department as to, okay, this needs to be restored, but what are we restoring it to? Mm-hmm. What period in time are we looking at to present to the public of the life of this vessel, you know, from 1919 up until 2003 when it had arrived? So I thought those were really interesting discussions that.
And it was, and we looked at that for numerous times, and it was really a no-brainer when it came right down to it, because the decision really was that it needed to be the Roen tug as opposed to the Butterfield or where it was after it left Roen. So we did a lot of research. June Larson, who was the assistant curator and archivist, searched files and looked up all kinds of things. So there's all, John had lots of things in his files, of course, but there's a really large amount of information about this tug from the very beginning right on, and that helped in the restoration. And Bob and the crew were very good about working to not make it look fancy, but make it look like it did when it was actually operating for Roen.
I think one of the key things, is you gotta remember that Andre colors were blue and white. And when it came back here, of course, that was pretty well faded and she looked pretty sad, but the Roen colors are red and black. And I know it came back in November, but I think it was in December. Bob had some of his people out on the upper deck of the pilot house with chipping hammers, taking off the paint so he could get it as quickly as possible into the red and black of the Roen. So that was, I know that was on his mind.
Because it was at Bay Ship when you started doing that, when it came in, wasn't it? When you guys first started hammering on it, because...
No, it actually was at the Roen dock
Was
first, and then it went over to Bay Ship after, but you guys had been working on it for a bit at
Oh, that's
at
right,
Roen.
because they took the screws out.
Right, so I can remember going over there at least once or twice or 3 times a week, and I would pretend that I was too well dressed to chip.
Hey, I chipped.
Yeah.
Well, we were pretty fortunate. We had a couple large donations that were made to the museum strictly for the restoration of the tug. And through that, we were able to work out some very favorable pricing from Bay Shipbuilding, who was trying to help us with the project. But we were able to dry dock it and sandblast the hull, remove the props, and weld up most of the sea chest and water intakes, and get her painted up on the bottom, I think, Bob, before we brought it back over.
Yeah, zebra mussels were
Oh, yeah.
2 or 3 inches thick on the whole hull, and they tried scraping them to begin with, and then they had to sandblast them off. And we had some donations from the paint companies,
Yep.
the Sherwin-Williams company.
Down in
donated
Gentile.
Valspar.
a lot of
Valspar.
paint, and Valspar company donated a lot of the paint for the inside.
It never would have been possible without the contributions, and I think
No.
the contributions never would have come had there not been the vision as to what it was going to be. And I think if you're from here, you can't really say no to John Asher because he's not going to take no.
Yeah.
So I think having that I think it's important. It was your family's history, and I think having that persistence behind and that passion, and then having someone like Bob Perlowitz, who was personally going to see to it that it was going to look right, that from a development standpoint, I think it told its own story. And you were able to see people coming out of the woodwork as, hey, well, I can contribute this, I can contribute this. There were gifts in kind, there was cash contributions. We were very fortunate with Bay Ship. It sat over at Great Lakes for a little while, and it came out of Bay Ship. So, I mean, there were a number of, individuals on the waterfront who were helping to make sure it got to where it is, but this never would have gotten here without just the vision that I think the museum had, but I think more so that Bob, John, and the donors.
Yeah, those donations were significant, and one of the things that I do share on tours is that while there was a core group of about 8 or so rehab people, probably a total of upwards, and I think the figure you gave me, Bob, was maybe 70 people had worked on it. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, people that brought special skills, the guys that worked on this bulkhead, taking off anywhere from 15 to 30 coats of paint, depending upon the tour guide, and restoring it to this beautiful oak wainscoting that you see.
Even as you're talking about the people, it was even people who had zero skill set. I mean, honestly, I chipped paint, I have no skill set to do this. But what I loved was when we would get the calls from people who had to do community service. Because it sounds funny, but these typically young men, would come down and I'd introduce them to Bob. This is this individual, or you need to go meet Bob. But you had one kid in particular who, I'm not sure if he came back, but he talked about coming back when his service hours were done, because I think he found, family might seem cliche, but he had found his place, his niche from having to do community service.
He did 50 hours of community service, and then he came back and did 50 more hours.
Right.
And
Wow.
that set of pictures I have back in the chief's room, he made up, and those were all pictures that he took while he was here.
I think that's one way that you can't see how a project like this touches a community, that, you have somebody who has done something that needs to
Sure.
pay a little time with, and it turns into a passion that he has and something that he felt compelled enough to document, and it's still sitting in here today, and he may not truly understand the impact this had on him, or, him on us.
I was even fortunate enough to come down on a few Sunday
Yeah,
mornings and chip paint on the boiler deck, which, as Brian, you said, there were probably 10, 15 coats.
and your wife painted the ceiling in the galley here.
Sandy painted the ceiling in here, so it was really a community effort.
Right.
And it could have been really, really overwhelming. I mean, I personally know there were times that I found this to be overwhelming from the position that I was in, because you would come down, and if you don't have this experience at this level of working with this, and you just go, when I walked into the engine room, I just kept shaking my head going, how is this going to be something the public can possibly walk through? How is liability insurance ever going to allow this to happen? And then you started watching it happen. And, for myself, it was such a great growing experience for myself as well.
Yeah, silence.
The silence of the sound.
The radio silence.
Yeah. I think a couple of things that I appreciated from the rehab crew side of things was the fact that Bob began to sense what our skills were or weren't. And he eventually knew who the people were that should be painting and the people that shouldn't be painting. And thankfully I was among those who should be painting, because I love it. But he didn't stand over us and observe. He didn't supervise right there on the spot. He just said, this is what needs to be done here, go ahead and do it. And most of the time it was to his satisfaction, because he had the vision, he had the knowledge of what this all looked like. So that was one positive thing from our standpoint. The other positive thing was the number of times you, John, came by and checked in with the crew. And the one time you were there taking photos. And I think those photos are now up in the exhibit in the museum with the model of the tug John Purves.
I really made an effort to try and get to the tug every day when you were working on it, even if it was only for 2 minutes or 5 minutes, or if I had longer conversations with Bob. But I needed to know from Bob if there was something you needed, something we had to be looking for, or whatever. So I felt like for 4 years I was a big part of this tug.
Well, you were.
Yeah.
It was, from a standpoint of having a staff at the museum and then having this project going on, that was a balancing act as well, because we would find ourselves so engrossed in what we were doing here, and it would be, all I had to do was go, oh my God, I have to drive down there, I have to go down there, I have to go on the tug to let them know we haven't forgotten them. But it was tough, but I always felt comfortable, because I knew you, in a sense, you were very much the leader on the project, and so it was easy to step away because you knew that you were there. Does that make sense? Because it
Makes sense to me.
Well, it was hard. It was a hard balancing act between the two locations, even though we're not physically far. If you walk in a straight line. But it was that constant reminder of, I must leave this office, I must drive over there.
Paul, was there any question in your mind who was the leader of the tug restoration?
Well, we let him think he was.
It was Susan. It was really Susan.
Yeah. Never a question, and you and I didn't know each other before.
Oh.
And so that, I remember the first day here, when a group of us arrived, and, you know, we had 40-some people at the first meeting up in the bridge room.
Mhm.
And when we had our first work day, there were maybe down to 30 or 25, and some of those walked after just taking a look at the project, and, you know, it wasn't for them,
No.
and I don't fault them for that. But Bob, you know, it developed from his supervision into what we were all saying as a rehab crew is into lasting friendships, and we cherish those friendships to this day.
I only wish that Bob worked as hard for me at Roen Salvage as he did when he took on the project of the Purves.
Yeah.
I have a little left.
So I think, you know, what we're all saying is that the sacrifice and the generosity and the commitment, and the passion to do this rehab, and I know June's going to be listening to this, and her constant reminder is it was not a restoration, it was a rehabilitation.
Right.
I guess you could say it was cosmetic restoration in terms of the outside, but it was really a rehabilitation, and it took all of that cooperation to make it happen.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you all can remember the day that we towed it from Roen Salvage and brought it to the museum, but what a glorious day that was.
Mhm.
I think most of the crew rode over
Yeah.
on the tug, and when it came through the bridge here, through the Oregon Bridge, there were a lot of people watching this. I mean, everybody knew that was the day it was coming over, and what a glorious day that was.
It was you know, that whole end process. I had accepted another position in April of 2008 and gave a month's notice, and it was really bittersweet because this arrived and I departed, and so it was hard to drive away, but I knew that everything that had been laid out here, that it had a place to come to. It was the business plan of really trying to figure out okay, I hope everything is in place so that when they open the doors, and when I came back for the opening, you guys invited me for the opening, there was no doubt. It was a sense of pride that I had, but it was more the pride in watching you guys.
I've been able to hear the comments of people on tours, as Bob has, but I'd be interested in you stepping back now, as you just said, and what are your thoughts when you look at the tug here? And what do you feel when you see this culmination of a long-held dream? What thoughts go through your mind?
Well, mine would be obviously it's part of our family. I mean, the tug was in the family, and I've taken rides on it with my grandfather and my mother across the lake. I knew how these vessels were kept in the Roen tradition. You could eat off the floor of the engine room. That's the way they were kept, and that's the way Bob brought this back to fruition. I mean, it was a beautiful job that he did on the tug. So I'm just beaming with pleasure every time I drive across the bridge and can look over here and look at the tug and know that it's back where she belongs.
I guess I come at it at a slightly different perspective. When I took the job as the first executive director, after doing a feasibility study to see if we could even build this building and have the tug here, or have a floating exhibit, it was kind of an accident. I was not looking for a job in a museum, and the board offered me the job, and I ended up going back to school to learn how to be a museum person, and also continue to do the fundraising part of what I did. And so every time, as John said, you're driving over the bridge, I look at this whole complex, not just the tug, but the museum itself. I can remember the meetings that we had to design the building, and how agonizing they were, and finally Ben coming up with this plan, and it really, really is a great facility, a facility that works well as a museum and an entertainment space that visitors come to on a regular basis, and you know, from my perspective, it's I'm most proud of what I was able to help accomplish here, and I say help because for the Tug, it was the people that had worked on it and sitting here at the table, but for the museum itself, it was hundreds of other people who made this place what it is, from donors to volunteers who helped set up exhibits.
For me, in looking at this, it's the reminder that if people put their mind to something, that it will be done. Because as I said earlier, I was nervous when we first went over to Muskegon. And Dan Osted would have called me a pessimist, and I would call myself a realist, because I just kept looking at the numbers and how are we going to make this work and how are we going to raise the funds. And so in the position that I was in, it was the fear factor in a sense. I knew the passion was there, I knew the excitement was there, I knew the product was there, and it was, how do we make this work? And I think when I drive over and I see this thing, it's that constant reminder to me, as if there is determination, and if there is will, and if there are people to do it, then anything is possible. Because there were times I didn't think, you would have asked me in November of 2003, I don't think I would be sitting in this boat right now. And it's so wonderful that I'm not only sitting in it, but they had to close it and stop people from coming in. And there's people walking around out here who wish they were on it right now. So, you know, it has absolutely been a success, and I think it's been a crucial piece of the maritime history that we haven't been able to present at the Maritime Museum, which was the floating exhibit, to give the true perspective of what one of these vessels had done. People see them working, but you can't board them, you can't do anything. So for them to truly get a sense of what it was to not only live on one, but work on one, and to see that the work that they're still doing today, I think, is just wonderful.
I was just glad that we could get the Tug back and get it back into the condition that I remember when I first came aboard the Tug. I remember I worked on the John Roen III, which was much smaller at the time, and I remember my first glance when I came aboard, and I remember standing down the engine room and looking up and thinking, you know, what a big, you know, beautiful Tug it was. And it was just completed at the time, and they were just finishing the painting on it in the shipyard. And that's basically the way we brought it back to, is when it was just brought back. And when you give a tour, and a lot of the people that come aboard, and thank you for all the work that went into it.
Pretty amazing. And
It's a lot of work.
you remember the most common word you hear when they walk down in the engine room?
I
Wow.
would say it's gotta be loud.
Wow. Wow. And that says it for me. So,
It's your opus, honestly. It's your opus to the community. It would not have been possible without John's determination, I'll use that word, but your vision and your ability to manage the people who came here. And I think they came here because of you, not because of the project, to be honest.
pretty unmanageable group.
Some of them, yes.
Well, you know, I went to a meeting of clergy, because I am a retired clergy, and I serve as the bishop of our church. Well, we had a meeting of bishops down in North Carolina, and we were seated around the room, and the opening part of our meeting is kind of updating everybody as to what we've been about and doing. So I pulled a photo out. And I said, well, I have to confess there's a new woman in my life. And their jaws dropped. And I said, she's beautiful, a little bit of age, but yeah, but just a wonderful, wonderful new woman in my life. And finally, I just couldn't hold back any longer. I flipped a photo, an enlarged photo of the Tug on the table, and they started to pass it around. Well, I think someone was thinking, wow, we had some real issues to deal with, but that's kind of the feeling that I have had when I look at it. It's just pride and being able to tell the story of Great Lakes tugboating from those years, mid-50s until the mid-70s, and its earlier life as Butterfield and its later life with other companies. So it is a tribute to a whole lot of people, and we're just grateful that the Tug is here.
Absolutely.
Any closing comments?
I think I would have told them that she was beautiful, had long, curvy lines, and was fast.
Wow.
Well, where were you when I needed you? Yeah, and isn't that true? What was the top speed of the Tug?
15 and a half,
And what was it when you were pulling a barge?
down about 10, 11.
10. But still, because of the power of the Tug.
Sure.
Yeah.
Did she win any of the tugboat races?
No. No.
She was a beauty, not a racer.
Only the John Roan 3 and the John Roan 5 were the only two that won races in the Detroit River tugboat races.
And they raced against the Atomic, didn't they?
Right.
Well, I thank you much.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
participation, and this story will live on for a long, long time because of your being here today and for what you have done.
Well, thanks for putting it together,
Hey.
Paul.
My pleasure and honor.
Great.
We're aboard the Tug John Purves at dock out in front of the Door County Maritime Museum in Sturgeon Bay. And in the galley with me is Dan Austed, past president of the board of directors of the museum. And I am Paul Groff, a member of the Rehab crew that worked between the years 2004 and 2008 to rehab the interior of the Tug. Dan, let's start with the dream. The museum had this long time dream of having a floating exhibit out in front of the museum. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a bit about that dream and how did it come to focus on the Tug John Purves?
Well, when we started planning this, we put together some plans and that for the museum and that, and we had to go to the city council to get approval for the piece of land. It was vacant land. It was for the city. Used to be boat launching facility, and we had a conceptual plan what it might look like. And in the conceptual plan, we always had a floating exhibit out in front, and we had no idea how important it was that we had that in the plan, and what we were going to put there, we never really knew. We talked about different boats and that, and we just waited. And John Asher, who was, as you know, the person that really put this all together, came to me one day and said, I think I can get the Purves. And I said, well, fine. What's it going to cost us? Oh, no, he said, I think I can get it donated. And I said, well, what does it cost to rehab it? And he said, well, $20,000. $20,000, we should be able to rehab it and get it. You're laughing, I know. And I said, well, that's a no-brainer, John. If we get the boat for free, $20,000, we can always scrap it with the Hayes boys and get our $20,000 back if it doesn't turn out good. Yeah. And I always remember telling them that. And what I thought was very important is the fact that when we went to the city council and threw the plan of the museum in front of them, the boat was a picture of the boat in front. And as it turned out, that was extremely important 10, 15 years later when we went to get permanent mooring status, that we said to the city, well, look, we've always said we're going to have a boat in front of here. and or some kind of floating exhibit. And as it turned out, then they gave us the privilege or the right to moor this. I don't know the particulars, but I think we got permanent mooring status and not costing a lot of money. So, but this whole thing evolved around John Asher, and of course, as you know and I know, John is the one that recruited Perlovitz and the crew that really started this out, and the incredible amount of hours that were put in. I know some of them were coffee drinking hours, but just the incredible amount of hours and the meticulous thing they did to this boat. So
Yeah, and you were, as I said, president of the board of directors, and can you recall what your role was in assisting John in bringing the Purves here?
I didn't really, other than say that's a great idea. As you well know how John operates, John just went off and did it himself. He really deserves the credit for all this. As a board, we talked it over and we agreed that that would be a good floating display. We didn't have any other ideas on where to get another boat or what kind of boat. I know one person in the community suggested we get the USS Wisconsin in here. And we told that person, and you'd never get it here. So we didn't have any idea. And then briefly someone said, well, let's get a minesweeper built at Peterson Builders or something to that effect. But we never really, that was just talk. And when John came up with this idea of getting the Purves back, and of course just a great job has been done by you guys and John, and that is really something. So.
Yes, and some of the challenges that were there, as you experienced it from your position, you mentioned before a figure of how much it cost or what they estimated, and then we also know that they figured it'd take 6 months to rehab the interior.
Okay.
So pick it up from there.
Well, John made that statement that it was going to cost that much, but we had no idea when we started what it was going to cost. Absolutely no idea. In fact, the whole museum, as you might know, they interviewed us, or we had an interview last week on how the whole museum evolved. And quite honestly, the whole thing evolved very much like the Tug John Purves off the seat of our pants with no plan, no consultant fee, a person coming in and tell you got to do this, you got to do that. And of course, John went out, and you know the figure, and I'll let you say the figure how much money is stuck into this. John went out and got an awful lot of the donations. He got one enormous donations that allowed us, allowed the Maritime Museum to put this in dry dock and weld up and take the propellers off and weld up all the underwater things that would cause leak over the years. Got it all sandblasted, and it's just a fantastic donation he got there. And then basically the museum, all the money raised for this was done separately from the museum. It was all got together by the people working there, and John went out and got everything donated more or less, as you well know.
Yes.
You can say the figure. I'm not going to publicly say the figure.
I can?
Sure.
Yeah, well, the reality is this 20,000 or 35,000, as I had heard it at the initial volunteers meeting, turned out to be close to $1 million.
I know that.
And you're right, seat of the pants kind of an operation, and those of us in the rehab crew never dreamed that it would take 5 years. You just kept working from place to place to place, and pretty soon began to see you were over more than halfway through.
The whole museum was built in that area of how we went through it. Like I said, we had this interview the other day, and the whole museum was just a great number of people volunteering at great hours. You threw the figure out $1 million, which I guess is true, but also the 30,000 man hours that you guys put in here is just unbelievable. I know some of it were coffee drinking hours, but my goodness gracious, 30,000 man hours are put in here, and it's continuing today. It's going to be climbing to, I have no idea what the figure is, but without you guys And gals, I must say,
That's right.
there was also a lady, or at least one I know did an awful lot of painting and all that. And so it went really fantastic. And the board really didn't talk about it much. I know one of the board members from North was skeptical on all it, but John basically overran him and got her done the way it should have been done. So
Right. And it was a real privilege and honor to be a part of it. Now, as you see the Tug John Purves at dock in front of the Maritime Museum, what comes to your mind? What's kind of an emotion or a feeling that you see as you cross the bridges?
you might know that it'll go off on the interview.
Oh, you
That's
forgot
what
to turn it off.
Yeah. I can remember 2306.
2306.
Yeah, I remember that.
2306.
Yeah, it's part of the community and been part of the community. I don't think a lot of people understood the Roen involvement in the community, how they, and I don't know if this one did it, but the tugboats and how they used to have tugboat races on over by Detroit and how
Right.
Cap Roen and that, and this was all part of that tugboat. So it tells the history. People really don't know a heck of a lot about it. And of course, we got visions on, or they had visions on putting docks around the outside of the tug here someday and rafting some other boats off. And there's all kinds of ideas what to do, but this will show the people, Door County and the state and wherever they come from, a thing that's really gone. I think this, I don't really know, but I think this boat pulled some of the log rafts, I think,
It did.
from Superior or wherever they picked those log rafts. A lot of people don't understand that, and this is all part of the history of Door County, and so it's preserved very good now.
Yeah, the tug had two lives. It was first called the Butterfield
Correct.
and built in 1919, and then Cap Roen brought the tug here with some cash and trading his John Roen III for the then Butterfield,
Okay.
and rebuilt it, repowered it, and renamed it to John Purves, his good friend and business partner with the Roen Steam Ship Company.
I think it's important to remember too that this tugboat served in World War II as part of the Army in, I think, the Aleutian Islands in Alaska or someplace in Alaska. So it's sort of like an individual. It's got a life of its own, and it's served in World War II. It's a veteran of World War II. So that's quite interesting, I think.
Yeah, I was towing barges of war supplies from
Whatever, yeah.
Seattle, Washington area, which is
Okay.
a huge military installation, and up to the Aleutian chain. So it has a storied history, and we as docents have been pleased to be able to tell the Great Lakes story of this tug. And this tug has sailed all of the both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, all the Great Lakes, and so it's traveled a lot of miles over its many years. But it's this story of Cap John Roen and this tug being a part of his steamship company that we wanted to share with folks. And when they come through the tug, that's the story we tell. And now as we look at the future, from your perspective, what do you think might be the challenges facing the museum in terms of ensuring that this tug is here for many, many years to come?
Well, the biggest challenge in the museum, and I'm no longer the president, but the biggest challenge has and will remain forever money, and money to support things like this. And I don't know the exact figures of how many people have visited this tug and gone through it, but there's an expense here of keeping it heated in the wintertime, and a lot of maintenance should be done to it. So it's always has been and will remain a struggle for the museum. A lot of people don't realize the museum is not government connected at all.
Right.
So it's a private 501c3 organization that continually has to get money somehow. And of course, the tug participates in getting more people to visit the museum and that. And I don't know the figures if it generates enough money to help. I know it generates enough money to justify itself, but there again, the thing that I saw coming and maybe right now, I think you guys volunteer all your hours for docents.
Correct.
And as we all know in today's life is to get people to volunteer day in, day out, year in, year out is always a challenge. And there might become a day when the docents might have to get paid, so, you know, because you don't have enough that would do it for nothing. So that's probably the biggest challenge is keeping the docents volunteering their time. At least that was my idea, and I think that's not wrong. We get them to volunteer their time. So
Up until this summer, we have had a docent on duty every day of the week during our open season. But this summer, we've had some days that tugs close, and you're identifying what will be a huge challenge in the future. And the tug it pays for itself with the dollars people pay to come in, and some extra, but not the extra kind of dollars. For instance, the decks of the tug need to be repainted, and that means grinding them down to bare metal, priming and painting them, and that takes volunteers, and not just anybody can do that kind of work. So we're going to be looking for volunteers.
There's an awful lot of people that don't want to do it too, you know, 'cause that's pretty gruesome work. So
yeah. So those are certainly two significant challenges. Do you have any closing thoughts? Anything that you said you had a story to tell? I don't know if.
well, I kind of wove it in on $20,000 and getting it donated, and another interesting story is the steering wheel. This tug came within an eye shot of being a disaster with the steering wheel with was it the binnacle with the magnifying glass that if the people that are watching us get in the pilot house. There was it a binnacle? Is that what they called it?
Right.
Okay, in there at one time, and due to fate, the sun when it set would go through the magnifying glass, and the way I hear the story, there was somebody in your photographing something. They could smell something burning about 5-6 o'clock at night, and they went up there and found out that the steering wheel was nearly on fire, just minutes away from going into and that would have been a disaster because basically there was nobody around, and that would have destroyed this tug big time. I think, you know, it would have really. I think that's really interesting. The magnifying through the lens of the binnacle when the sun set almost started the steering wheel on fire. So,
well, it's close calls.
Yep.
From being coal-fired, steam-powered, sailing Atlantic, Pacific, surviving World War II, did not go to the scrapper's torch by the last company that held it. It's now sitting at dock here, still safe. But we had a film crew up there, we being the museum, and they were the ones that noticed the smoke curling up in that late afternoon sun coming through the magnifying glass, just like we did as kids. It was putting holes in the wheel, and that is a wheel which, by the way, you constructed because the original Roen wheel was gone when we got the tug.
Right. So, I thought that you could bring it up that I made it. So, so I just really a great story on what's been done, and you know, really almost the tug has been pretty much run independently of the museum. You know, there's sort of been a crew of their own and a staff of their own, and I know you guys have taken ownership of it, guys and gals, you know, taken ownership of it, and the museum certainly welcomes the asset of the tug and how much interest they've shown, you know, brought people in to see the museum and the tug. So,
and in all ways, though, overall it's been a partnership, and a partnership that we hope will be perpetuated down through the years. So one of the things I observe is that relatively few Sturgeon Bay, Door County people have come through the museum. So maybe that's one thing we can say, that we're constantly encouraging people. The tourists come, they love it. In fact, one of the main things they say when they come in the engine room is, wow.
yeah.
And
It's not uncommon. I'm connected a little bit with the other museum, being on the county board and etc. And that's one of the biggest obstacles of both museums is getting the people from Sturgeon Bay and Door County to visit. And some of them, you know, you talk to them, well, yeah, I was in the museum 9 years ago or something like that, or 8 years ago. And that's always been a problem, getting the local people to go through the museum and see. I'll bet you 25% have gone through it, and there's another 80% out here have never toured the Tug from the city and from the county.
Right.
And that's a challenge to try to get the local people to appreciate and understand what we have here.
Right.
So
I think I can safely say for both of us and for all who have participated in the project from the museum side and then from the volunteer side, I think I can say that 75 total people put their time in on the Tug. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, and then the core group of 8 of us who did the interior work and with the project all 5 years. I think for everyone, we can say there's a great deal of pride in what was accomplished and a commitment to see that this project continues for a long, long time to come, because it is a project still in process, and it's our hope that there will be others to step into the line of duty, so to speak, to continue the maintenance, to continue the tours, to know the story, and that's what's most important, to know the story of the Tug John Purves and its role it played here in Sturgeon Bay as a part of Roen Steam Ship Company.
I think another thing that's got to be stated is that, and I said something before about that, but most museums are supported by a government. You know, like the Neville Museum is supported by the Green Bay City, I think, and the Historical Museum here in town is supported by the Door County taxpayers. But this is a standalone. Everything was either donated or given. The only thing that was really given to us was a piece of property that the museum sits on. The city, at first we rented it, and then we asked the city to give it to us, and they have given it to us. So the piece of property that the museum sits on and where the Tug sits is all owned by the museum. But I think it has to be noted that this is, it's amazing that it's still going and going so good without having a government stand behind it, and that it's a private, not a private, I guess it's public, but not government run or anything else. And that's
Correct.
really something that's amazing.
Well, my thanks to you for your
Okay.
role, and appreciate everything you did to make this possible, working under John Asher's guidance.
Yeah.
And it's,
More so
it's
than you think.
been a great experience. Well, welcome aboard the Tug John Purves. It's located in front of the Door County Maritime Museum and the Lighthouse Preservation Society at the foot of the Michigan Street Bridge, Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin. I'm Paul Groff, and I've been asked to conduct these interviews by the Maritime Museum staff and to interview each member of the Rehab crew who worked on the Tug between January of 2004 and July of 2008, preparing this Tug for public tours. Each of us present here in the gallery remember the story. We were members of that Rehab crew, and we each have something to share, and that's what we want to talk about today. It was quite an experience, and we know that our combined work, volunteer work on the Tug, along with a number of other people, mounted up to over 30,000 volunteer hours, which is pretty darn significant. So I'm going to begin by reading an article which kind of started this whole thing. It's an article from the Door County Advocate in 2004, the month of January. Volunteers needed to restore Tug. The first meeting of volunteers for the restoration of the Tug John Purves will be held at the Door County Maritime Museum at 5:30 p.m. Wednesday, January 14th in the Bridge Room. Volunteers are needed with various skills in piping, painting, electrical, mechanical, carpentry, and any general help. Anyone interested may call Doug Henderson at 743-5958. That is the invitation that I think brought all of us here. And I'd like to kind of step stone from that to now have you introduce yourselves so that you know who you are and a little bit about what brought you here.
Okay,
I'm Roger Blazer. I've been on the tug here since it came in. I was a letter carrier for 34 years in Sturgeon Bay, and just a joy to polish all the brass and the fart holes and everything on this boat.
And I'm Mikey. I had been a partner in the CPA firm before retiring up here in 1998. I was working at first for the volunteering over at Habitat, and that's where I met Susan. I never read that article in the paper announcing the beginning, but I knew Susie. And when we came to Thanksgiving time and we're going to be building during that period of time on the house, Susan said to Dilly and I, "Why don't you go on down and volunteer for the tug?" So we went over and met Doug, came and met Bob, and the rest, as they say, is history.
I'm Jerri Mcwilliams. I'm probably the outsider of this group. I live in Florida in the winter, and I live in Wisconsin in the summertime. And I accidentally met Roger out here at the airport. And, and we were out there watching some guys practice for the EAA, and struck up a conversation with he and Gail. And he told me about the tug and said they were looking for people to help. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting, so I came down and took a look. Prior to that, I worked for IBM for 31 years, and I also spent 8 years in the Navy, in submarine service.
My name is Mark DeYoung. I own a manufacturing company and an industrial distributor in Appleton, and I didn't read Paul's article. I retired in May and golfed a lot and had a volunteer job with Meals on Wheels and later with Loaves and Fishes, and when winter came I had time on my hands, and so I thought I wanted to volunteer somewhere. So I tried Habitat for Humanity and they didn't return my calls. I went to the physical address, they weren't there, and my beautiful talented wife went online and said, "Mark, you know, there's a tugboat you can work on down at the museum." And I was here the next day because I love tugboats. And I ran into Paul first and I said, "I'd like to volunteer." And he says, "Well, you gotta talk to the chief." So I went and told Perlowitz that, you know, I really don't have any skills at all. But after that, to help out where I can, I said I could sweep dirt off the floor. And they said, "Sure, come on board." So I've been here ever since, and I loved it.
Yeah, morning. Jerri Mcwilliams, Sturgeon Bay, retired Door County Highway Department after 32 years, and before that, total years of 38 years of driving truck. My first job high school was sailing for Roen Steam Ship, and I was on the John Roen 4 for 3 years. And when I found out about this thing, I thought, well, I owe Cap and I owe John Purves something, so I came over and did whatever I could, mostly hammering paint off.
Like the rest of us.
My name is Bob Purves, 31 years in the Air Force, and then another 18 with a credit union out in California. And just came back to Sturgeon Bay in 2007, so I just kind of a Johnny-come-lately here. Did work on the tug to help for 2 years. I learned about it from Susie. We were at church and she introduced herself to me, and I knew that the tug was here, but I didn't know what was going on. And she said, "You know, you just go over there and, well, any day, but go on a Wednesday and you can start working." And I said, "Really?" So the next Wednesday I was here. And that's how it all began.
When are you just going to start working though? I missed that part.
And obviously it was special for me because John Purves is my father and who the tug was named after, so that's it.
I'm Susan Baston. I'm retired from our HVAC business here in town. I had volunteered at Habitat, but they had more people than they needed, and I read the article that Paul read, and when it said you didn't need any talent, I said, that's for me. So I did a lot of degreasing and painting. Enjoyed every minute of working with this crazy crew.
And again, I'm Paul Groff, and I read that article and responded, wanted to come be a part of this group. After the first gathering, I wasn't quite sure if I did want to be a part of it, but I am retired clergy, and this is where I gathered a lot of stories for my sermons.
What not to do?
Thou shalt not.
I cleaned them up and I still couldn't use it.
I'm Bob Perlowitz. I worked on the tug for a number of years, and after I got off of the tug here, I worked for the Roen Steam Ship, or the Roen Salvage Company for 25 years.
I'd like to ask, what was your first reaction when you walked aboard the tug? Now, for those who were there from the beginning, there was a certain kind of reaction, and for those of you who weren't Johnny-come-latelys, I mean, you became an important part of the crew, and you had maybe a different kind of recollection. So let me just ask, Mike, what was your impression when you first stepped on board and saw the work that was to be done?
I didn't believe it was going to be done. No, and the two things that it came out most clearly was the steel. I've just never been inside of anything that was just steel all over the place. I was used to working with wood and things like that. And the other thing was stink. It did stink of old diesel. and even sometimes, well, yeah. You should have seen him in his greasier days when he was cleaning off the top of the jet. And the smell coming off. But those were the first two, steel and stink.
Sue, how about for you?
First impression, Bob guided me through the tug, and I thought this job is just not ever going to end, and plugged away at it. It was the smell as well. Sometimes the boat would rock a bit when you were down on a corner of the tug. You'd feel a little bit woozy, but not often.
Well, Bob, you certainly had a first look at the tug, and when did you first see the tug outside of Sturgeon Bay, and then what did you think when you walked in and saw the condition?
I went over to Muskegon where the tug was with John Asher and Brian Kelsey, and I thought it was in pretty bad shape, but I never thought that it would take as long as it did. But considering the crew that we had,
It took longer.
yeah. Oh, it went pretty good. I used to tell some of my tours that we had to retrain everybody because most of them were college educated and never had a workbook.
All right, how about for those who came into the middle of it? There's Jerry and Bob. Jerry, how about from you?
Well, my first impression when I walked aboard here was, what have you got into? But after meeting some of the guys and going around, my first job was with Mike over here up shipping paint. I said, well, this is what I did in the Navy, tried to get out of, and here I am doing it for nothing. So, and the other thing that struck me was it smelled just like a submarine I'd been on.
Bob?
Well, it's one thing that, well, I was just amazed. First of all, you'd already been at it for 3 years, and I got on here, I said, oh my gosh, we're gonna be here for another 5 years here. Because I just couldn't imagine, they could see how much there was to do, and I just couldn't imagine what it must have looked like when you first began. Because, and I think I asked Bob quite a few times, where on earth did you begin? How did you know where to begin? Because it was pretty bad shape, even after you'd been at it for 3 years, you know. But anyway, just an amazing, amazing project.
The first thing I recall was 4 G words: greasy, grimy, gritty, grungy, and on one of my tours, a woman said, "How about gross?" Gross would cover the stench in the tug when we walked aboard. We had workers come aboard the very first day of work, took a look, took a smell, and walked off. Wasn't for them, and it really wasn't for everybody. So, anybody have anything else to add on them?
Right, it's following up on that point. This guy became such a magnificent predictor of which volunteers would stay, which wouldn't. Like the fellow who was upstairs putting the epoxy in a hole in the floor. And he got seasick. We weren't moving, but every time he stood up, he didn't know which way was up because nothing is up and down on this boat. Nothing is straight. And when he walks off at the end, Bob said, he won't be back. And he never did come back.
I remember a guy who brought a level on
Oh,
board
yeah,
with his own
wasn't that
toolkit.
stupid?
Yeah, because nothing's level on this boat, nothing's square. I recall coming home from work one day, and my wife made me take my clothes off outside. And I'd hand them to her, she'd throw them straight into the washing machine. And then,
She's a very horny woman.
yes, she is. And after 45 minutes, I would get cleaned up, and I was sitting there, and she gave me a beer, and she looked at me and said, "Do you really enjoy that work?" And I said, "No, nobody enjoys that work." But I enjoy the BS sessions in the morning, the coffee with the boys and girls, although I know you don't mind being called one of the guys, Susie.
Guys is fine.
And I said I enjoy lunch and all the BS there, and I enjoy Miller time, which is true. It was all fun.
Seems to me that a significant question would be, what do you think that you personally contributed? You know, think of, we heard some of it here, you know, the chipping of paint, but think of an area in which you worked and some of the feeling you had while you were accomplishing that task. Raj?
Well, I think when I started on, Bob put me in the old lavatory down there building a workbench. So after that was done, then I started taking off portholes and polishing brass in a water tank down in the engine room. So there's a couple hundred bolts and nuts that are taken out and all polished and redone, paint all chipped off of the portholes and redone. So it was quite an undertaking for me.
I told lots of people who came through on tours that anything downstairs that shines is because of this.
Don't touch it.
Yeah.
You heard the brass monkey polish? I think we got that too.
Monkey butt.
And Jerry?
Yeah. Well, when I walked in this thing and I took one look at it and I thought, oh my God, it never was like this at Roen's. And like you say, where do you start? Well, you start in one corner. At the end of the day, you haven't accomplished a darn thing. At the end of the week, well, it's a little bit more, and at the end of the month, by golly, I did get something done. And slowly but surely, yeah, we got it done. But, oh, by the way, I heard that your wife hosed you off with the garden hose before she let you in the house.
That's not true, she never did.
Jerry, we referred to it before, but tell us a little bit about spending all of your day sleeping up on the tank.
Well, I didn't spend all of it up there.
He did sign in, you know, when he put his name in there.
I did do some work up there, and it got uncomfortable laying on the metal, on the steel, so I got myself a gallon bucket and I caved in the inside so I could use it as a pillow. And it just, you know, it wasn't so hard that way.
Maybe you better tell what you were doing up there.
First of all, chipping paint off the fuel tank, cleaning it on top, and then painting. And yeah, it took a long time. And then I had...
And you signed your name up there.
Yes, he did.
I did?
Back there.
No kidding.
You don't remember that, huh?
Somebody must have done that.
Well, like someone doing your honor, you gotta be kidding.
Why not? Is it still there, or did you take it off?
No, it's still there.
Anybody else have anything on this area?
Well, I remember the first job I did was sanding the main engines. And I'd sit through with my rotary sander and I'd sand and sand and sand and sand, and Bob would walk by and I'd sand and sand and Bob would walk by. And then finally he'd say, well, that's looking pretty good there, Mark. And then I know I could go to the next one.
And mine was working with Dilly. I did spend an inordinate amount of time working with Dilly, mostly to keep him out of trouble and to make him aware of consequences of some of his foolishness.
Well, he didn't stop bleeding though, did he?
But he knew which way was up and down because of the dribble coming out of his nose. It always just followed ground. But the first job he put us on down here was putting in that wooden structure that's down at the foot of the stairs over against the wall, and he wanted to hang, Bob did, he wanted to hang some wrenches and things like that there. Look, he looked at that and said, how they go? Because there were all of these projections coming out like this, and it had to fit behind, and wood doesn't bend like that, so he got the great idea, and it was a great idea. He was good on ideas. Yes, but we walked over to the, or rode over to the place that was selling refrigerators and things on the corner over there, and we got some big cardboard, and that's what we started on, is making a shape out of a cardboard, using that as a template, cutting the wood for it, and then trying to make the down thing fit. And that took like a week. It was amazing.
Good thing we had time on our hands.
Well, Susan, why don't you describe your main contribution? Because I'm holding here MVP, which is most valuable painter. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was just one of the painters. Everybody here painted it, a lot. But I remember all the grime and grease that had to come off before you could start to paint. And then you had to rough up the surface, grind it down before you could paint. And then laying on my belly underneath the bottom shelf of a linen closet with an artist brush, painting that mopboard and wondering who would ever see this. But yeah, the guys didn't know me when I cleaned up for this picture. Who's that?
This was Susie's picture.
Oh, come on, what have you done? Oh,
And there's another view of Susie right up right there.
That's the one that was in the pilot house.
I do have to say that I sure put up with a lot of guff, and yes, they
Oh, you
learned
gave out as good as
they
you
learned
got.
that I could give it back, so I got it double.
I think we take our hats off to you for putting up with all of us. You hung right in there, and we do appreciate it. And which reminds us that there is a testimony to Sue's participation in the tug. It's down in the engine room on one of the covers in the engine.
Yes.
Who would like to describe that? I know that you're all lost for words, but...
Well, Bob did it, and they
Perhaps the
couldn't
guy
describe it.
that said
whoever
it
painted
as
it, let
well.
him describe
Yeah, why don't you...
Perhaps.
Go ahead.
We were chipping the doors. Susie had a bench up above by the boiler, and she was chipping the paint on the doors. And she said to me one day, the handles looked like daisies or black-eyed Susan. And she said, I think I'll paint all the doors different colors. So we left her paint up one door and left her sign it.
No, that's not my handwriting.
Well, I can remember what her comment was when she walked into the engine room for a work day. She looked at that and she said, who's the smart that painted that? And we all swore to ignorance. But it's painted in her favorite team colors, Packard green and gold,
Yep.
and a daisy,
Yep.
or a
Black-eyed
black-eyed
Susan.
Susan, and with her name on it. Now, who really was the artiste responsible?
I'm not saying.
Not too terribly far.
Well, obviously, we had a lot of laughs along the way, and amidst all of the chipping and the polishing and the scraping and the cleaning, priming and the painting, we had fun. Can you think of what for you was perhaps the most humorous or funnest time in the whole experience? I see Mike is just chomping at the bit. He can't wait to jump in.
Well, you may not believe this, but you know, these guys who worked on the tugboat loved nothing more than breaking chops. Someone else's besides theirs. They just would come at it, especially the large body one down over here. And so one day, oh, and we're also creatures of habit, okay? And one of the habits was that this gentleman, well, he's U.S. Air Force, but over there, who, yes, are you also? He used to always have these liverwurst sandwiches, really good Braunschweiger coming down. And we're coming up for lunchtime, and Bob's walking up the stairs and he says, watch this. And I said, what's going on? He says, just watch Bob. Well, Bob, you tell me. And then he bites into his sandwich and he goes, and then he tries one more time. He can't go through because this ass here has put a piece of cardboard the same shape right in the middle of it, and sandwiches then. And this guy over here, all the things that has come out of the bishop's mouth, one of the things was the odor of good Limburger cheese. And he discovered that both of us love Limburger, and Limburger on top of Braunschweiger on a sandwich, and he's other guy, whoa. It was wonderful.
You start be salivating in a moment.
Well, I recall lunch, it must have been a Wednesday, and we're sitting up here, and of course, Susie was down painting in the engine room, which she always did.
Yeah, she was in front of the.
But she came up this day, yes, and she threw a Victoria's Secret catalog on the desk that says, Thursday's my birthday, boys. And then Purves for the next 2 months fantasized about Persian capris or something. What was that? Brazilian something or another.
Never happened. Purves' catalog. Where he buys Bill's things.
It wasn't Brazilian something?
Yeah.
No.
Brazilian bikini or something?
Brazilian bikini, yeah.
Stories and lies do come easily to
Well, one more Susie story, and this is true.
I'll get back at you.
And I'm giving a tour, and you know, where do you live? Oh, I live over on Purves Lagoon. I said, oh, you know Susie Batson? Oh, yeah, we all know Susie Batson. I said, well, you know she's been working out lately? I said, really? I said, oh, yeah. And I opened up the cupboard up there, that picture. And they said, oh my gosh, wait till I see Susie.
But he opened it up for his friends one day, and it was his picture on that body. That shut him up for just a minute.
And he had friends from California.
Yes,
And his
yes.
wife, yeah.
But being from California, they kind of appreciate it.
Yeah.
Well, shutting Bob up isn't necessarily a bad thing.
That's true.
You just gotta keep track of him, because you don't wanna turn your back too much.
Well, one of the things that we haven't gotten to is two areas. One is what this guy contributed to the whole experience, but we came to learn that he was the master practical joker. Do any of you remember some of the things that he pulled? Because he won't admit to telling it now, I'm sure. Any of you remember?
You won't admit to anything.
Well, I do recall a story of his where he had a wiper who couldn't tell port from starboard, so he painted one of his tennis shoes green and the other one red. True story.
Or the day he found sneakers tied to a rope and trailing the tug. And
Untied one of them?
untied one, kept it, tied the other, put it out again, brought it to dinner table, and this kid came in and he said, oh, I feel bad. And Bob said, what's wrong? He said, well, I had my sneaker down there. I was cleaning them, washing them behind the tug. And he said, I lost one. Because I pulled it in, there's only one sneaker there. And he said, what am I going to do with one sneaker? So he tossed it overboard. True story?
True story.
Yeah, this guy picks up the sneakers and, oh, are you looking for this?
I can remember
And he
once
threw that one overboard.
sitting around reading through Learning and Retirement's catalog. And a lot of goofy courses, you know. And I said to Bob, well, are you going to write your own you know, biography, and he says, if I did, my wife would divorce me.
Well, going to that other side, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on what it was like to work under this guy's supervision. And because he had a special way of doing this, and so who wants to jump into that? Jerry?
Well, I don't know, what I would say is he had a way of suggesting something that you thought that was the best idea going. And you just jump into it and do it.
You'll Huckleberry Finn. Awesome.
Yeah, his suggestion was, you know, you can do this, and, okay, I'll tackle that job because I know damn well that the next one is gonna be worse. You'll be down in the bills working.
I know about that.
But you know, I hate to be too serious about him and his leadership, but two things always struck me. One was at the end of the day, he'd stand back there like the pontiff, you know, as we're all filing off, and just with that crooked smile of his, just say, thanks a bunch. And it was the most sincere thank you ever got.
It really was.
Just to say, especially because you knew that if we hadn't done it, he would have done it, and there would be no job at all. But the other thing was that after a while, it is maybe too serious for this group, but after a while, he became like, you didn't have to ask, how should we do this? We'd all ask, what would Bob do? He set a new standard of quality that was just unbeatable.
There was
So
only
you
one
look
way
at
to
it
do
and
it,
say,
anything.
yeah, it was the right way. And just, okay, we'll take the damn nut off and we'll polish up the brass. It was great.
I remember sometimes when you'd be chipping paint and you'd find out that there was brass or copper under there.
Yeah.
You wanted to quick repaint over it.
Yeah, one little story a guy can pass on, when he was sailing on a Purves there, they used to have a washing machine on the back in the winch room. And that came from one of the engineers who wanted to coin up washing. And you didn't have to put money in the thing, all you had to do was push the button in and it would work. But all the new guys that came on board, you gotta put quarters in there. So when the box got full, the machine didn't work anymore. Well, call the chief. So he'd come up, he'd take the box out, empty the quarters, put it back in. He said, it's fixed now. And he said, oh, by the way, I can make change for you guys.
You know, if I could throw in one other short story, it's one of the guys who was in here, well, Jim Costigan. And this is on how Bob knew how to spring off of each other. Costigan was down there, and there's these valves, big mothers like this, and bolts on it that make a hit his ass. Oh, I'm trying to get this thing off, and pressing it, I can't do it. And Bob would just look down and say, oh, that's okay, I'll go get Susan. She'll do it.
All of a sudden, the guys would find some
Some way of making
unknown
it happen.
strength so that he wouldn't have to go get Susie to do it. But Bob, he never criticized your work. He just stayed late on the tug and redid it, I think.
One of the things I experienced was the fact that the freedom that he gave us, and I think this has come out in some of the comments, but the reality is, he said, for instance, he put me down there in the engine room on the port side with those pumps chipping, and then the brass that came up, you know, at the end of the pumps, but he didn't stand looking over your shoulder. You know, he had faith and trust in all of us that we would do it, or as you said, maybe come back after hours and redo it. I don't think he had to do much of that, but the reality was he wasn't there monitoring you every step of the way, and a lot of commendation. You know, looked pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good. Move on, and I appreciated that.
He doesn't take compliments very well, so.
No, and he's got a wonderful man. He managed by example. I mean, you had to work as hard as he did, which was very difficult to do.
I remember cleaning brushes after everyone would finish. He'd go down and check our paintbrushes, And if they weren't cleaned to perfection, he'd start in on them again. They were pretty valuable pieces of equipment to have. And not only that, but the rags couldn't all be thrown in a barrel or we would have set the whole tug on fire that night. So Bob would be out hanging up rags for us.
Yeah. One of the other things about painting that Bob was good at, he said, well, go up there and start painting on the fuel tank up there. Well, I need a brush. So he would come along with one of those Purwood specials. A 4-inch brush. Here you go.
But you know, maybe the worst job on this boat was taking the crap off the floor here in the galley.
I didn't think I'd ever get out into this
Oh,
thing.
that was a terrible job.
Can you tell a little more about that, what we were doing?
There was like 14 coats of paint on this floor. Maybe all gray, maybe there's a brown in there. But the natural floor is perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect, the natural non-skid surface. And why anybody put 14 coats of paint on there. But we use zip strip and take one layer off, more zip strip, another layer off. It took, I don't know, 2 weeks maybe to get it all out. It was a long
Started
time.
going.
Oh, yeah. That's why I'm nuts now.
And I came into the galley and I saw all you guys on your knees and I thought, they can't be praying.
Right on to it. Well, Paul was.
Not too sure about that.
But see, that's funny too, because here, it took so long. Dilly, I wish Dilly were here because he you know, validate all these things. He wouldn't stop calling that stuff on the floor terrazzo. He called it terrazzo. He said, it's terrazzo. Terrazzo. And he said, the terrazzo on the floor. And I put in the damn dictionary to show him it's terrazzo. There is no terrazzo. And then he went and remembered he put that Latin sign downstairs, and the Latin was wrong. And he said, that's what, oh, it's wrong. So he doesn't know to this day. He will now if he ever sees this. But I took the damn thing down, took it home, found the typeset that he was using it, and I made it right.
Did he appreciate that? Did he thank you for that?
Your previous training allowed you to do that.
Allowed me to do that.
Damn Jesuits, I swear to God.
Well, let's take a moment, since Art isn't here, because he was an integral part. Now, what did he contribute, besides his wry sense of humor? What did you see him
Well,
contribute?
there was an awful lot of noise.
Yes.
The rat.
A lot of blood.
When he found the computers there,
He loved
Oh, I know.
He loved that man.
He was good at measuring too.
Yeah.
Fridays, it was just
Yep.
me.
He'd stick that ruler out and he'd measure
Oh,
4
yeah.
times and get it right.
Sure.
still too short.
Cut it 3 times, it's still too short.
You know, the first couple of days that Art was on here, I'd been on here quite a while, and he says, well, I guess I'm the old fart on this tug. And I said, I don't know, Art. I don't think so. He says, yeah. He says, I'm the oldest guy on your boat. And I said, no, I think I got you. He says, let me see your driver's license. So I got it out and it says 4-4-33. I said, now let's see yours. He says 4-7-33. So I had him by 3 days.
But he did look older.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the funny things that happened, I was working up on top of the fuel tank, and everything was quiet, and somebody woke me up, and there was somebody on the workbench, and, hey, Mikey, and he couldn't see me because of the partition there, so, Mikey, Mikey, what, who's up, what, and Mikey, it's time. Mikey, it's time to do what? Who's saying? Who's talking? Who's saying this? Then he got smart and he poked his head around the corner. He says, "I'll get you."
Yeah, that's gullible type. We just suck it all up.
I recall a time I was working in the engine room. No, I was in the winch room. And I was cleaning up, and I came up into this area, and I just reached in. My wedding band was gone. And I just absolutely went berserk. I went to where I had my backpack and personal stuff and looked there. I went back to where I'd been working in the winch room on the starboard side, and I looked through there, nothing. And I walked up this way, and Susie was here, and I don't know if you remember that. I said, Susie, she's gonna kill me, she's gonna kill me. She said, what are you talking about? I said, my wife's gonna kill me, I lost my wedding band. Oh, she said, don't worry about it, Jane will be all right with it. I said, no, she's gonna be very upset. So I left the tug, didn't find it, went home, and she was not upset, just like you said. But a couple days later, I get a phone call, and it's Pearlie. He said, you been looking for something? And I forgot. I said, no, not necessarily. You lost something? He said, yeah, my wedding band. He said, well, I think you may have it. And I came to the tug the next day. They were a couple of you. I don't know which one of you were standing there. Pearlie was back there. And he said, just go up and look in the galley on the table, which I did. Well, it was under a magazine, which I had been told about. So I picked up the magazine, and I went to put it on, didn't fit. Went to put it on my little finger, didn't even fit there. And besides, it was yellow gold, not white gold. And so I said, oh my gosh, and I'm getting frantic by then. What are you trying to pull on me? Well, there they all were standing back in the passageway, just grinning like Cheshire cats. And here he had taken, do you still have that ring on? No, you don't. Yeah, it was one of his fat, pudgy figures, I know. Well, it was his ring or somebody else's, and then he pulled out my ring. Here, Art Dilly had been working back in the winch room, and there's a drain, but the drain stands off the deck about that far, and he was going to unplug it. Before he did that, he looked in, and he saw this glistening object, my ring. Now, how could it fall, of all places, there? And so I have to give thanks to Art Dilly for saving my marriage.
There's one thing that we didn't mention. We mentioned lunchtime, but we never mentioned breakfast. And the work on this used to start pretty probably like at 8:30 or 8 o'clock or whatever the heck it was, until this little fella here, he came on board. And then he'd come, and for one thing, if anyone came in after he did, oh, we've been working here since 6:30 this morning, where have you been? And he always had a box of donuts.
Day old.
And day old donuts, because they were cheaper. But they're also good. And then Dilly, because he was so predictable, we would always have bets about which one would Dilly pick out when he came back from an LIR course or whatever else to eat.
The goopies.
And the goopies. What a sweet tooth that guy had. Man.
Best part of Wednesday afternoon was when Bob came around and gave everybody the word that it was Miller time. Always had cold beers for everybody.
Did you buy all that beer, Bob?
I think he bought most of them.
I think the museum bought them.
Yeah.
Fat chance.
I don't think so.
Took it out of the cookie jar.
That's when the story started.
Well, I'd like to go to an entirely different question, and I'd like to have each one of us answer, and we can start down there with Roger. But how do you feel you personally benefited from this experience, the 5 years of rehabbing the tug John Purves?
It got me out of the house.
Oh,
The first day I came down here, I worked on a Monday. I told my wife, you know, I like this. I said, next week I think maybe I'll work Monday and Tuesday. Well, she was ecstatic, you know. So got done with the third week, and I said, you know, I'm going to work 3 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And it turned out beautiful. I had something to do, she had something to do by ourselves, and it was, Wednesday was probably the best work day of the week, because everybody was here. But, it was just fabulous, just working on this old tug. Of course, Jerry and I worked on the John Roen IV, which was the Queen of the Lake sitting lake.
Well, yeah, it was the flagship of the fleet. Did you know
Flagship
that?
of the fleet, John Roen IV.
Bob knows that. He
Would you
doesn't
agree
wanna
with that,
admit it.
Bob?
It was much smaller.
Yeah, 8 foot wider.
Same length, only 5 feet wider, yeah.
See all the fights.
You don't ever be sold.
where she pulled, Jerry, she could pull this thing backwards clear to where?
Well, the fork
Clear to
could
the East
have,
Coast, right?
fork could have hooked onto this thing and pulled it all the way to the salt water and backwards.
Yeah.
Not even gone in, not even worked up a sweat.
Remember, the chief's gonna have final word on this. Mike, how about for you?
You saw you put this. I think the greatest benefit, honestly, was the sense of tremendous pride. You took in your work after a while, and then the work of everyone. I mean, when this boat was done, even now, I can't come across the bridge and involuntarily I look over here and think, damn, that's a beautiful building. You know? And it is. And it is a thing of beauty, but it wasn't to begin with. And to watch it unpeel itself bit by bit and be polished up and chipped on down.
Feels a good way
painted
to
up.
put that, too.
You know, it was, that to me, it's a great thing.
What was it that Mrs. Leckie, when she come over, back over here at the christening, said, I think I'll take the tug back with me?
Yeah.
Because I've never seen it looking so good.
Jerry?
I think for me, being an outsider, meeting all these guys and the camaraderie that we developed and made me feel good just being down here. And like Mike says, I still feel a little pride, especially when I come down here and running a tour and you still hear the really nice comments from the people going through. A lot of them think you're nuts because you went through this. But,
Didn't take much.
Mark, how about for you?
Well, I came on the tug because I love tugboats, but I stayed because I love the people. I mean,
Did you bring your violin?
you know, I'm serious. I mean, it a bunch of the best people I've ever known in my life, and that's the truth. And it was fun, always. I don't know, it was just fun. And it got me out of the house too, which my wife appreciated.
Well, the thing is, my grandfather was a tugboat man on the steam tugs in Sturgeon Bay. He actually worked for Roen Steam Ship. And he was a chief engineer and unlimited horsepower on the Great Lakes. So he could run anything. And when I went sailing right after I got out of high school, in fact 3 days after, my grandpa was ecstatic. He was so glad somebody was going to go on the tugboats and work. And my mother said, you aren't going on those, you'll drown. And I said, well, I could drown out here in the bay swimming across the too.
Well, you're still with us, Roger. So.
Yeah, I'm still here. They tried to get rid of me, but.
Yeah. One of the things that I always get a kick out of when I think about it, Bob was giving a tour out there in the fantail, and I come walking across, I would pretty see some light bulbs. And Bob says, yeah, Purves, most powerful tug on the Great Lakes. And I went, and I heard one of the guys in the tour say, what was that all about? Bob says dryly, oh, Jerry sailed in one of the other tugs.
Well, very honestly, you know, because the tug was named after my dad, you know, you gotta be a little lucky who your parents are, and I was really, really lucky. He was just a wonderful father, and frankly, I just thought I kind of owed it to him to work on it and help with the restoration. And I'll never forget the day he came home when Roen bought this tug in 1956. He had 4 tugs: the John Roen III, John Roen IV, John Roen V. My dad just assumed this would be the 6th. I remember him coming home, he said, my gosh, he named it after me. But, you know, he met Roen when he was 26 years old in 1928. And he always said he never got a promotion. He was hired to help manage the steamship company, and 48 years later, he was still helping to manage the company. But his lucky day, he always said, was the day he met Captain Roen. And so it was just a thrill for me to come and take part in this, and it was fun.
When I give tours as a docent on the tug, it's really a lot of pleasure to be able to tell people the backstory of how it got like this. 2 stories about the tug, the history of it and the rehab. And just the pride in the work that we did and did it right, and the compliments are wonderful to hear.
And the same thing as this, the Tug is a veteran of the United States Army. It served during World War II,
There's our.
down in the Caribbean and up in Alaska.
How about for you, Bob? You had to administer this whole group.
Well, Dilly, better late than never.
Yeah, Art, we're just kind of winding down. We did talk about your contribution to the project was very little, but
We did mention the noise you made.
yeah,
The rattler.
yeah. And but we were just going around the group, kind of wrapping things up, talking about what to be gained from this experience. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts on what you gained from being a part of the 5 years of rehab.
Okay. Right now?
Right now.
I thought I was going to make up something. Well, I think a lot of friends and something worthwhile to do in retirement and staying active. I guess that pretty well does it.
He's in it for your words. But what about his role also when we had our little dinners and things? And
Well, one thing I would say is there isn't anything made out of wood in here that I didn't make. The top of the the top of the desk chart table, the doors, the connections,
Raft.
the raft. Yeah, we made the raft. That was fun. Weighed about 1.5 tons.
Took a crane to put it up there.
Yeah.
It barely fits.
Yeah. We weren't here the day they put it up, and I guess they're up there with a crane with that thing and a whole bunch of people and a lot of expense, and it had about that much clearance on it. Just the way we planned it.
That's why you measure twice, right?
Right.
Well, we had rehab crew banquet out at the mill, I believe it was.
Chicken dinner.
And we had, our wives and our girlfriends, but not both, that kind of thing, and our spouse. And then we each received one of these. And this was a plaque that you made for all of us, with a photo of the tug on it, and the number of hours that we had put in on the project. And that was just at one stage. We hadn't even finished yet. And then you served as master of ceremonies and led the evening's festivities and program. And do you remember any of the wisdom that you shared with us, or any of
No,
your significant?
but I'm sure I was really good.
You did complain that you never had a locker. That you did complain.
Well, I don't remember that. Did you have one?
Yeah, Roger and I both had
Why
lockers.
the hell didn't I have one?
Because we beat you by one day.
Yeah.
I must say, the only person I've ever met in my life who brought his lunch in a briefcase. And I remember your lunch bucket very well.
Yeah, my lunch bucket was 100 and some years old. Belonged to my grandfather, my great-grandfather. It's one of those oblong ones with a metal cover
With a
and
can on
a
top.
cup on the top.
Yeah.
A1 shape, and I shouldn't have been bringing it down here because some guy told me that he'd seen one on television that was all beat up. It was worth $180. So I figured mine was worth at least $500.
The thing for me that, and this is where we're going around, Art, and talk about what we gained from the experience. Being retired clergy, my whole career was in a totally different field. And,
Yeah, you only work one day a week.
but not everybody knows how to work one day a week. It takes a certain kind of individual with certain characteristics and personality traits to handle that kind of schedule. So I guess when you're working with people, you don't always see results immediately, but in working with the tug, as you move from section to section and chipped the paint off and ground it down and primed it and painted it, you saw the results. And we did reach that point when we got over that 3-year period where we could look back and see the significant work that was done. And I gained a whole lot from working around you folks and working with you folks, and the friendships, the relationships developed that have really lasted right on into the present. And I value that tremendously. You're on, Bob.
Well, we were really lucky to have, you know, such a crew. Everybody had a skill, even if it was chipping paint or painting and
Cleaning grease, yeah.
yeah.
Or cleaning the bilge.
Everything had to get done, and over the course of the 5 years that it took, we got the job done, and really proud of everybody.
And I think this could be a good place to close, because I think without this guy, this would not have happened.
Nothing would
And
Thank you. No,
thanks to John Asher, who asked him to take on this task of supervising the rehab, and he said yes, and it happened because of him. And working under him was great. He loved to tell us what to do, but he also liked to tell us where to go. And that happened once in a while. But we give credit to Bob and the countless hours he spent down here just caring for this tug, making sure that everything was just right, making sure that all the hatches were closed, and caring for it as if it were his own. Well, he had 23 years invested in this tug, and he wanted to make sure that everything was right with his baby. So I give credit to him.